We now move on to plenary address, which will be chaired by Dr. Azam, Dean of Faculty of Economics at the Lahore School of Economics. Our plenary speaker is Professor Valente from the University of Bristol. She is an applied microeconomist whose research focuses on household decision-making in low-income settings, particularly around human capital investment and contraception, and how these are shaped by policy interventions. Professor Valente is also affiliated with JPAL and the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Institute of Labor Economics. We are honored to have her with us today. I now request Dr. Azam to begin the plenary session.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Valente. I think my colleague has already introduced you, but it's a pleasure having you here and looking forward to your talk. Please, I welcome you and invite you to the podium.
Hello everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for being generous with a few words. Thank you all for the organizers for giving me this opportunity and also for gathering all these wonderful people together. I really look forward to the next couple of days. Thank you very much really for the enlightening words. So I hope I will say something that is relevant to Pakistan. There is a connection with macro issues. You might all think I mentioned it at the start. And yeah, I wish I had more to say specifically about all these issues that have really sort of made me think and maybe sometimes wonder about what my research can say about these bigger problems. And there are some news, but yes, I wish I could say more. So yeah, I'll start the talk now. So I don't know if there should be some time at the end for Q&As.
Maybe about 5-10 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So yes, so today I'm going to talk about demand for contraception in high-fertility environments. And so the first thing, which I think is where the real link with what's going on at the macroeconomic level is that a demographic shift is underway. Across the world, it's undeniable that there's a huge decrease in fertility, and the IMF also has a lot to say about this. So for instance, you will all have seen headlines about how fertility is going down and there are a number of concerns that arise from this. For instance, the IMF here in this post from Instagram highlights that the concern about a possible shortage of ideas with decreasing population and specifically population of working age. However, fertility is not decreasing fast everywhere. So I was glad that the reference to India and Bangladeshi neighbors was made earlier, because that's also what I've done in this graph. So here I have plotted the change in total fertility rate, so that's the predicted total number of children per woman over her lifetime in a number of countries. So the countries in red are countries in South Asia, so you can see Pakistan, Bangladesh and India, which in 1960 had about the same total fertility rate at about 6 children per woman, and yes, there has been a decrease in the three countries, but you can see that the fertility rate in the three countries has decreased at a very different rate. So in Pakistan, which is the top line here, the fertility rate has decreased, but maybe not so drastically, and is still about 4 children per woman today, whereas in India it has decreased steadily since the 1960s, and in Bangladesh there was this clear acceleration here around about 1980 onwards, and is now also decreasing steeply. At the same time, of course, another great country, Brazil, has also had a pattern very similar to India. So, in a different presentation or a different lecture, I would love to think about the link with income growth, but that's not what I'm going to do today. But, of course, it's hard not to think about it when you see this graph. And then when we look at other high-income countries such as the UK and the USA, that have had fertility around about replacement rates since the 1980s, there has been a sharp, not a sharp, but like a further decrease in the recent years, which has led to a lot of interrogations. However, if you look at a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and again, I'm very careful about not presenting sub-Saharan Africa or indeed, low-income countries in general as a bloc. There's lots of heterogeneity, which is one of the points that the graph is making. So if you look even within East Africa, so that's the lines in purple, you can see that Ethiopia here has had an acceleration in decrease in fertility, to an extent as well in, I believe this is Ethiopia, sorry, and then Tanzania here. However, you also have countries in Central Africa, so here that's RDC, the official acronym of RDC, COD for some reason. And you can see here that the total fertility rate, which was also about 6, just like India in 1960s, is pretty much still 6 today. And then in Nigeria, which is the line in blue, and a country where I do quite a lot of research at the moment, and which hopefully I will speak to a bit later on in this talk, there has been a decrease in fertility, but this decrease is relatively slow, and total fertility rates are still just shy of 5 children per month. So yes, overall, definitely a large decrease in fertility. This creates a number of issues, and from a macroeconomic point of view, for instance, it also raises the question of the servicing of the debt, because obviously, for a given debt, the fewer working people you have to repay this debt, the higher the weight of the debt per capita. So this combination of decreasing fertility but at different rates in different countries is leading to huge shifts in the composition of the world population. Oops, sorry. So if you look, for instance, at this graph, you can see that Pakistan is supposed, for instance, or is expected to be the third largest country in the world by the end of the century. But also Nigeria and DRC are supposed to be larger in population than the US. So here I'm not saying whether it's good or bad, or like what the fascinating implications of all this are, but I'm just making the statement that what's going on is massive. And it's going to affect a lot of things that we can even start to, we can only start to imagine now. So within this context, so in this context, I would like to talk about demand for contraception. So yes, so as I said, I'm not going to go into all the fascinating consequences of these large movements of dynamic population dynamics, and I will also not go into all the factors that may explain part of these dynamics. I'm going to focus today on what determines contraceptive use, and more specifically, I'm going to try to speak to what affects contraceptive use beyond the obvious, which is the number of children, or whether or not people want to have another child, and more specifically whether or not women want to have another child. And I will refer to this as demand for contraception for short. Also to define terms, so what I mean here by contraception is not modern contraception only, it's basically anything that is done purposefully to reduce the risk of pregnancy. So given this broad definition, any increase in contraception should lead to a decrease in fertility, at least in the short term. So why should we care about contraception? So here I'm going to start by presenting what is the standard microeconomist view of contraception, or at least has definitely been until now, which Valente in 1984 in a provocative and very influential paper, Population Development Review, referred to as the desired children view. And it's defined as the view that high fertility primarily reflects desired birth and that couples are roughly able to achieve their fertility targets. This view is held by most economists who have studied fertility behavior. And here I should mention that desired means not, in an ideal world without constraints, the quantity of children people want to have given the constraints they face, including their budget constraints. And Pritchett adds, the decision to have another child is simply too important and too costly for contraceptive costs to play a major role. In other words, people in high fertility environments have lots of children because they want to have lots of children. And contraception is just a convenient technology to achieve these targets. And that's certainly a view that, as an economist, I used to find extremely convincing. But I also see now, and I would like to share with you some of my more recent thoughts on that this desired fertility view also has its limitations. I should also add as caveat that in 1994, as of Richard's paper, the idea that this view was the one held by most economists who have studied fertility behavior was definitely correct. I would say now that probably we would say that still most microeconomists that have studied fertility hold this view. It's not so clear when you look at microeconomic studies, which obviously have different, adopt different methods. And I'm not going to argue here in favor of one or the other. However, I think it's fair to say that lots of recent macro studies actually attribute quite a lot of the recent decrease in fertility in low-income countries to contraceptive access and cost. Another aspect of the standard economist view of contraception is that essentially an increased use of modern contraception does not imply a reduction in long-term fertility. So first, economists have long pointed out that there are so many rigorous evaluations of family planning interventions. By rigorous, I mean that meets the standards of causal evidence that we tend to have in macroeconomics today. And also, importantly, few of these studies look at effects on fertility outcomes rather than just contraception outcomes, and fewer even look at fertility outcomes in the long run. So this lack of data on the impact of family planning programs on fertility and in the long run essentially sustains the standard skepticism that many economists have had about the potential impact of family planning interventions to reduce fertility in the long run. So why are the outcomes routinely measured in those evaluations not enough? So first, the focus is typically on modern contraceptive use. But modern contraception is substitutable with traditional approaches to reducing fertility, controlling fertility. And therefore, an increase in modern contraceptive use does not imply an increase in overall reduction or overall contraception if you include traditional methods. The second aspect is that even if fertility decreases in the short run, there is no guarantee that completed fertility will also be lower. In other words, perhaps these interventions only increase birth spacing, which has benefits for welfare because it improves the health of mothers and children, and they have other beneficial effects. But in terms of long-term fertility, it is not clear that they actually reduce it, even when these programs have an effect on contraception. And so what is the evidence in favor of this standard view? So first, Pritchett in 1994 famously showed that there is an R-squared of 0.91 when you regard total fertility rate on desired total fertility. In other words, 91% of the variation in total fertility rates across countries, at least that's as of 1994, could be explained by variation in total desired fertility. And Grant Miller, one of my co-authors in much of the work I've done on this topic, finds that family planning program in Colombia called Pro-Familia explains less than 10% of Colombia's fertility decline during its demographic transition. Then in reviews, economists who have reviewed this literature have highlighted the fact that in the range of that in most of these studies, the impact of family planning interventions on fertility is in the range of 5 to 35% fewer children ever born, which they've argued are small effects. And it's true that if you look at some randomized control trials, where you would expect to have reliable causal evidence from, so a number of RCTs that have randomized subsidies for contraceptive use find no effect on contraceptive use. And so here I'm mentioning a few. There is, however, evidence against this standard view. So first, I really welcome the opportunity to do this presentation, partly because it gave me an excuse to spend a bit more time on the literature than I would maybe normally. And when you dig into the studies, what I find is that maybe the effects aren't so small after all. So first, of course, Bongart's a leading scholar in the area of family planning, argued, in response to the paper, that reduction in fertility of 5 to 10% actually represents a large share of unwanted fertility, and therefore these are not small effects. But also, a point that I would like to make is that a lot of the time, the studies that we have, especially the better identified studies where you have some sort of quasi-experiment behind the evaluation design, these studies tend to have a so-called reduced form approach. Okay? In other words, what you estimate is an intention to treat effect. And so, an intention to treat effect of, say, which is a reduction of, say, 10% in fertility, may sound a bit underwhelming, but if what it actually did was only change the behavior or only affect a small proportion of the sample, then maybe these effects are so small. Okay, so maybe I'll be a tiny bit more technical now, but essentially, so often these so-called first stage estimates are not actually documented in papers, often because they can't be, so it's not always easy to assess that. But for instance, in this study by Kelly Jones in 2015, which looks at something that is, maybe sadly timely, she looks at the effect of a reduction in US funding in family planning, so across sub-Saharan Africa and across other countries, but she looks specifically at the case of Ghana, and she finds an increase in pregnancies following the decrease in supply by about 10%, and a 7 to 10% increase in birth for the poorest women, and 3 to 6% for other women. And so this may look like a relatively small effect. However, when she looks at this first stage, she also documents that what happened following decreasing US funding was a reduction in supply by 10% nationwide. So if you had just told me that a 10% decrease in supply led to an increase in pregnancies by 10%, then I think I would have thought, well, that's a pretty large effect. So I think that we need to be, maybe a little bit careful, let's say, about the first stage that we're talking about, and also measurement error, which is likely to lead to attenuation bias, in many cases. And more recently, again, some family planning scholars have looked at a very, descriptive exercise, but close to that attempted by Valente back in 1994. So what they've done is that they looked at how much of the increase in contraceptive use that's been observed over the last 40 years in low-income countries can be accounted for by changes in stated fertility preferences, and more specifically decreases in stated fertility preferences. And actually they find that these changes in desired fertility, if you like, can only account for about 10 to 15% of the increase in contraceptive use. So some more evidence against the standard view is that some family planning interventions do have large impacts. So again, yes, follow-ups beyond 1 year tend to be rare, and often they focus, and so you can't really say much about what happens to completed fertility. However, some types of studies definitely find large impacts of interventions such as specifically antenatal and postnatal interventions, for instance, on postpartum use. There's also a recent RCT in urban Galilee where Kara et al. Find that there was a reduction by 2.2 percentage points in birth out of a control average of 5% of new birth within 2 years of giving birth. And again, subsidies, yes, often lead to no effect at all, but in some situations, in some cases, RCTs have also found that subsidies have sometimes large effects. For instance, in a recent study by Susan Athy and co-authors, again in urban Senegal, they find that subsidizing the take-up of long-acting reversible contraception increased take-up from 11 to 28%. And so this is me revisiting the evidence by Richards in this 1994 paper. So here I just reproduced the figure showing the relationship between total fertility rate and the desired total fertility rate, but I added the 45-degree line in red. And the point I'm making here is having a high R-squared in general doesn't necessarily mean that there is no gap between desired fertility and actual fertility. I mean, you can think of it this way. If you reduced desired fertility by 2 children in every country, and you didn't change actual fertility, you would also have an R-squared that is very, very high. So here, for instance, what you can see is that, okay, the R-squared is very high, but most countries are above the 45-degree line, meaning that for most countries, total fertility rate is above desired fertility. Okay, and then the final slide on the evidence against this standard view is the incidence of unmet need, so-called unmet need for contraception, and the incidence of abortion. So you may have, if you've read any of the papers I've written on the subject in the 4 or 5 years, you've probably sadly heard the statistic that 1 in 4 women in low-income countries, I should say, 1 in 4 married women in low-income countries in reproductive years states in surveys that she does not want to have another child, at least in the next 2 years, but is not doing anything to prevent pregnancy. So she has this so-called unmet need for contraception. And in a recent paper in PLAS, along with authors, we find that desired fertility can be understated in surveys. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this, but just to say that I would advise everybody to take a pinch of salt when seeing these unmet need statistics. However, something that I personally find very convincing in terms of demonstrating the existence of and the prevalence of unwanted pregnancies is the high incidence of abortion. So even as recently as 2015-2018, about 30% of all pregnancies globally end in an induced abortion. I have checked the figures. I mean, of course, these are all estimates because a lot of abortion is illegal, and so there aren't great statistics everywhere. But there's about 100, actually, 30% is even potentially a bit conservative in the sense that there's about 140 million births every year, and there's an estimated 74 million induced abortions every year. So while I completely agree that the definition of unmet need is not ideal, potentially paternalistic, and there's now a lot of movement in the family planning literature to move towards different measures. And yes, desired fertility is probably underreported in many circumstances, and therefore unmet need for contraception may be overstated. And yes, there is measurement error in abortion incidence. And of course, as economists, we also think that, well, wait a minute, maybe there is an option value to getting pregnant. As in, maybe new information is revealed when a woman is pregnant that may mean that even though she did want to get pregnant, once she's pregnant, she actually finds out that she doesn't want to have a child. Despite all of this, I find it hard to deny the prevalence of mistimed and unwanted pregnancy being high, given these statistics. So to take stock of all this, before I hopefully say a few words on ongoing work, which I hope people find interesting. So yes, the much higher fertility in high fertility environments is very likely mostly due to much higher desired fertility. And lowering the price of modern contraception, is therefore not surprisingly not leading to massive increases in contraceptive use and decreases in fertility. Still, many women do appear to get pregnant when they wish they were not. And so this raises the question of why could this be the case, if not due to high financial costs? So why is there not more contraception or not higher demand for contraception? So So the first possibility, of course, is that there might be non-financial costs of contraception. And these may be too high relative to the cost of getting pregnant, generally. So for instance, there might be a high disutility from side effects of modern methods. So in self-reported reasons for not using contraception, when a woman says that she doesn't want to get pregnant, fear of side effects features quite prominently. About 1/4 of women say that it's because of side effects. However, in recent work with Bristol and Flower in Mozambique and in Nigeria, where we asked very, very detailed questions to women about their subjective expectations about what would happen if they used this or that method, or if they did not use any method of contraception, we find that they do expect a high chance of side effects with hormonal methods that aren't so different from the actual probability of side effects based on the existing statistics. And they do care about the risk of side effects to an extent when making decisions about whether or not to use contraception. However, it's not clear that if you corrected any misperceptions about side effects, you would get a very big change in contraceptive use, in demand for contraceptive use. Why? Because their expectations are so wrong to start with. So it's not like women have this idea that the chance of side effects is much higher than it actually is, and therefore do not use contraception because of that. It's not quite like that. They do care about side effects, but they actually have pretty accurate expectations about them. And of course, there could be other non-financial costs of using contraception coming from a costly disagreement with either your spouse or even your mother-in-law. I thought I would mention it since I was in a South Asian context doing this talk today. So there is recent evidence by ADE and co-authors on the role of the mother-in-law. But of course, most of the attention has been on the preferences specifically of spouses. So what do we know about the role of partners? So we know that if you give vouchers to women to use contraception without the knowledge of their husbands, then take-up is higher. But we also know that if you want to increase the take-up of counseling, or if you want to convey information to a couple that is relevant to their decision to use contraception or not, then the effects of it, then it's probably preferable to involve men. So, yes, partners do matter, and one has to be careful when designing programs about what is the intervention, because the consequences of involving men may be different depending on the intervention. Something that I've been working on specifically is also the possibility that there are miscalibrated subjective expectations. So in particular, we showed in a recent paper now in Journal Metrics that women tend to, so in this context in Mozambique, but we find similar effects, and in fact we find larger effects in Nigeria. Women tend to have a lower than statistically correct perceived risk of getting pregnant when they are not using contraception. In other words, part of the reason why contraceptive use is not higher is because women think that if they don't use contraception, their risk of getting pregnant is not quite as high as it actually is. And they do care about this risk of pregnancy when they make their decision to use contraception. Therefore, if you can correct these miscalibrated beliefs, then this analysis predicts that it will increase take-up. Something that has received quite a bit more attention beforehand, and that we also speak to in our work, is that there might be perceived long-term effects on fecundity. In other words, some women may think, or some men may think, that when you use hormonal types of contraception, especially, it can reduce your ability to get pregnant later on in life. So it's probably the case. Qualitative work, especially that looks more specifically at who believes that and specifically in what context, tend to suggest that it is especially true for younger women, nulliparous women, as in women who haven't had children before. And indeed, there's a recent RCT by Nathalie Bauer and authors in an urban setting in Zambia, where they find that amongst young women, if you give information, if you dispel myths about the long-term effects on fecundity, then it increases stay. However, again, in our work where we collect subjective expectations data, so when you ask women what they think is the chance that they will manage to get pregnant within 12 months of discontinuing a method, and when you ask them what they think is the chance that they will manage to get pregnant if they wanted to, even in the next 12 months, if they did not use any contraception, there is almost no difference in their perceived chance of conceiving. Which means that amongst this sample of women, there's no evidence that they think that there's a long-term effect on fecundity. But these samples that we study are married women, de facto or de jure, married women above 18. And so I think there is probably heterogeneity according to your age and whether or not you know labor or not. And then there could be behavioral biases, such as present bias, just with any other type of preventive, adoption of preventive technology. So there's a state, and I couldn't see a lot of evidence on this, so if you have any studies, to refer me to that, right? But there's a recent RCT by Jessica Lee and authors where they send text messages reminders to nudge people into attending contraceptive clinics, and they find that it increases use by 5%. So to conclude, based on prior work, before I say a few words about the latest area that I've been working on, further subsidizing the cost of modern contraception is unlikely to increase contraceptive use very much in many low-income country settings. However, many women are getting pregnant when they wish they did not. And that's really what I want to emphasize here. This is likely due to a combination of many reasons. So as economists, I think we often here's this thing, here's the magical answer that's going to completely change the game. I think that what I want to emphasize is that there is no single silver bullet, but that there are a number of factors that explain the gap between fertility desires and contraceptive practices, namely ease of access being one, but of course also the role of partners, bias, subjective expectations, risk exposure, etc., etc. So even though there is no one single answer that completely accounts for this, when you add everything all up together, it may make, or it can make a big difference. An important caveat that I also want to raise is that all the literature so far, or nearly all the well-identified literature so far, which is reasonably recent, is based on data collected in a world of very easy access and high subsidization. And for better or worse, probably for worse, we are now entering a world of massively diminished funding. And so I think we should really not be complacent and assume that what we know to be the case so far will continue to be the case in the next years. So I will now turn to recent ongoing work. So this is still very preliminary, but I'm really excited to present it to you. And of course, any comments would be very welcome over the next few days. So what we're working on various things, but the one I'm going to talk about today is basically presenting new insights on the role of partners. And this paper is joined with Bernard and Albert Bauer, and it's called Subjective Expectations of Husbands and Wives and Couples in Mental Contraception. So what is the motivation behind this research? So even if you don't do research on fertility, if you're in this room, many of you probably do research that has to do with some intra-household decision, or to whom intra-household considerations can be relevant. So I think that this is a more general point that we're making with this work than just about contraception. So many consequential decisions are made as a couple, and what is widely recognized is that husband and wife may have different preferences, and that the preferences of both spouses may matter in a decision. What is a lot less well recognized, however, is that many of these decisions are made under a substantial amount of uncertainty, and that husbands and wives may have different subjective expectations, so may have different beliefs about how certain actions would translate into certain outcomes. So preferences are about how much you like the outcomes, if you like, whereas subjective beliefs, or beliefs for sure today, have to do with how do you think that a certain action is likely to translate into an outcome. And this is really important. Why? Because you can imagine, for instance, cases where, say, two spouses have exactly the same preferences, but they have very different beliefs, and therefore they disagree on actions even though they have the same preferences. And we study this, basically, this question in the context of demand for contraception. Okay, so for once in my life I have a fun slide in my presentation. So this is just to make the point about the difference in preferences, or rather bargaining weights, as you know them, which is basically the weight that the couple puts on the preferences of a spouse versus the preferences of the other. So here we have three couples where you have one of them who is extremely famous, and he's, either an actor or a very successful singer, has lots of money, etc. And therefore, you would expect, if you think of the bargaining literature, that they will have very high utility weights associated to them. So, for instance, here, Meryl Streep, okay, is married to a sculptor. A sculptor. And so you would expect her to have, you'd expect the Streep couple to put a lot of weight on what Meryl wants. However, when they're purchasing a sculpture, they probably put a lot of weight on what, I don't know if the husband's name, unfortunately, but on what he thinks is a good investment. Here we have, the Clooney's, and so George Clooney, probably has a lot of, or you would expect him to have a lot of huge bargaining power. Okay, so the couple puts a lot of weight on his utility, on the outcome he wants, but whenever they need to make a decision about legal matters, then Amal is the expert. And so they probably put a lot of weight on what she thinks is the right thing to do to achieve a certain outcome. I mean, not only the right thing to do, but what will happen in terms of outcomes if one chooses one course of action versus another. So I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to go quite quickly, so I do apologize. Very quickly. So we collect data from 5 different states in Nigeria, very heterogeneous population. And we collect the subjective expectations. So quantitatively, we ascertain using the sort of, as rigorous, the most rigorous methods, that are available and well documented in the literature. We measure quantitatively what each spouse, interviewed separately, thinks will happen if they did this or that in terms of contraception, in terms of the number of outcomes. So for instance, we ask, imagine you didn't use any contraception, what do you think is the chance that you get pregnant in the next 12 months? And we also ask the husband, imagine that this wife of yours, even if they have another one, this particular wife of yours, imagine that she didn't use contraception in the next 12 months, then what do you think is the chance that you get pregnant? And we also ask about the chance of side effects, expected chance of approval by people of the same religion, etc., etc. Not just for using no contraception, but also for all the possible actions that the couple has in their choice set. So using method A that they know about, method B that they know about, method C, etc. And then we use this to model the amount of contraception. So I'm going to go really quickly, but the first thing we find is that husband and wife, so even though on average men and women have very similar distribution of beliefs, so here in blue is the beliefs of women and in orange the beliefs of men, and you can see that in general the distributions don't look so different. This one is about perceived risk of pregnancy specifically, but it's the same thing for most beliefs. So 2 points here. First, both men and women underestimate the risk of getting pregnant when you're not using contraception, and they overestimate the failure rate of modern methods. However, so men and women taken separately, not so different beliefs, and miscalibrated in relevant ways. However, when you look at the intra-household correlation in beliefs, it's not that high. So here, you can see the numbers for yourself, but for instance, since I was talking about the perceived risk of getting pregnant, with no method or each of the various methods, the correlation between the husband beliefs and the wife's beliefs are about 0.37. So what is, and then we estimate the model. Okay, so what is the model intuition in brief? So the model intuition is that essentially we assume that the couple chooses the option, so doing nothing or using method A, B, C, etc. That gives them, as a couple, the highest utility, the highest level of satisfaction. And the combination of what we know about what they think would happen if they did X or Y, and what they actually do, allows us to pin down how much the couple cares about X or Y happening or not happening. Okay, so we cannot observe the beliefs of the couple as a unit. Of course, the only thing that we can measure is the beliefs of the wife and the beliefs of the husband. Therefore, we need to make some assumptions and impose some structure in order to be able to aggregate this. And what we do is that we make this assumption. We make this so-called restricted Pareto optimality condition that says, not so, for those of you who are familiar with this Pareto optimality assumption, we are not assuming that it holds unconditionally. We are assuming that it holds if husband and wife have the same beliefs. In other words, if husband and wife have the same beliefs about how actions translate into outcomes, then the couple will never choose an alternative, never choose an option that we never choose an option that would increase the utility of one of the spouses without decreasing that of the other. Okay, but it's only if they have the same beliefs. And now I'm going to go very quickly. Okay. I'm not going to, linger too long, but I'm going to probably take a couple more minutes just to, sorry, it's slow between slides. So I just want to show you this, okay? So this is the subjective expected utility function of the couple under the assumption I just stated. And the thing that I want to highlight is that under this assumption, you can write this equation and then estimate a model where what we estimate is the coefficients that are associated with, here that's the probabilities, so that's the beliefs of the wife in couple C, and here that's the beliefs or probabilities of the husband in couple C, and that's the expected monetary costs of husband here and of wife. Okay. And what I want to highlight is the idea that what we estimate in the model is the coefficient associated with each of the variables in black. Okay. So we estimate the objects in red as a whole, and the omegas here are the utility weights. So here is the utility weight of the wife for event J, like getting pregnant or people of the same religion approve. And so 1 minus omega JW is the utility weight, sorry, I said utility weight, the beliefs weight, sorry. Omega is the beliefs weight of the wife here, and here this is the belief weight of the husband. So therefore, and this is the same as this, therefore when you compare the coefficient associated with the belief of the wife to that associated to the coefficient associated with the belief of the husband, then if one is larger than the other, because this is the same for both, it implies something about the relative weight that the couple puts on the belief of husband versus wife. So we can do a number of things thanks to that. So that's when I will quickly again. But what we find, so what we find a number of things, but the one I'm going to focus on is that so far, so first, husband, we find that the way that the couple puts on the beliefs of husband and wife is different. We can reject that. The second thing is that it also depends on the domain. So when you look, for instance, at the belief that the spouses have regarding the risk of pregnancy, or the risk of pregnancy after discontinuation, okay, this one speaks to the beliefs about potential effects on long-term fecundity, the beliefs that they have on the quality of side effects, etc., etc. The conclusion as to Whether the couple puts more weight on the beliefs of the wife or the beliefs of the husband varies. And the pattern that we see, again, these are preliminary findings, but the pattern that we see, I think, is very interesting. Namely, what we find is that when it comes to something that has to do with the technology of contraception, or with contact with the health system, where you would expect it to be more considered a woman's issue, then the couple puts more weight on the beliefs of the wife. But when you look at things that are more intangible, such as approval by people of the same religion, and potentially in some specifications at least, the beliefs about the long-term fecundity effect of contraception, then they put more weight on the beliefs of the husband. Again, this is not saying anything about the weight that the couple puts on the preferences of husband and wife. This is saying something about the perceived expertise of husband and wife as perceived by the couple, as revealed by their decisions. And this is relevant in terms of policy implications, because the implications of this result so far is that when you have an intervention that targets, for instance, knowledge about contraceptive methods or misperceptions about the health system, then it would, holding everything else constant, it would be more effective to target women. Whereas when it comes to maybe changing things that are more intangible, regarding, for instance, approval or perceived approval by people of the same religion, if there are misperceptions in this area, then our model would predict that it would be more effective to target men. Okay, so I will wrap up. I've got a little time. So, a brief conclusion, first on our paper, and then just one slide of overall conclusion. So we find that husbands and wives' beliefs differ substantially. And it's not just noise, on the contrary, the estimates we get are very sensible, as in the directions of the effects and also to an extent the magnitudes are as expected, which would be the case if we just had measurement error explaining differences in beliefs by husbands and wives. And we also find that the couple's overall weights on wives' beliefs are generally larger in magnitude than that of husbands. But there are exceptions, and specifically religious approval, and to a lesser extent future fecundity, which is consistent with perceived gendered areas of expertise, and this has implications for the targeting of information interventions. Specifically, this model motivates an ongoing RCT where we target women's beliefs about own pregnancy risk and contraception, but more generally, I think that this type of exercise could be a good way of informing the design of interventions that tend to target only one area. And to conclude, overall, this talk, many women wish they were not pregnant despite an overall fertility decrease. And the focus so far has been, on the one hand, mostly by family planning scholars, I would say, and demographers, on the supply of modern contraceptives and the perception of modern contraceptive use as progress. Or on the other hand, mostly from microeconomists, the focus has been on the role of desired fertility due to preferences, and preferences that are typically thought of as entrenched and not something that we may easily change or we may even want to change. As in, it's not clear that changing these preferences is necessarily welfare improving. But I want to highlight the possibility of other fruitful explanations for the low prevalence of pregnancy avoidance practices, even though there is no silver bullet and there is no magic recipe. In particular, I'd like to highlight the role of subjective expectations and how they differ between spouses. So that, as I said earlier, this may generate different desires in terms of contraceptive use by spouses, even when they have the same preferences about fertility, for instance. And again, to finish on this word of caution, that we should not be complacent about what we know so far, including from previous work I've done, concluding that further subsidizing supply or further improving access will not have much of an effect. This is likely to be true in a world of plentiful supply and very heavily subsidized prices. It's not clear that this will continue to be the case. Thank you. you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was fascinating. Oh, why don't you join us as a guest? I think we're running a few minutes late, but I just think that it would be unfair not to open it up and ask Christine about some of these issues. I mean, I found it fascinating. I mean, I'm not working in issues of contraception or family planning, but these ideas of correlation of beliefs, which is fascinating, is very relevant to a lot of the work I do, actually, micro-level framework. But let's open it up first to questions. Comments, questions. We have faculty here, we have students. Yes, someone in the back there, please.
Hello, ma'am. It was a wonderful presentation. Thanks for the remarks. My question is that what's the personal motivation behind the topic that you focus on? Because since you mentioned that you are a microeconomist, but I would ask that if you are a microeconomist, so you will be interested in the household welfare effects, and I might be interested in the national welfare effects. So first of all, if you are interested in the household welfare effects, so how do you see the impact, the demand for the contraceptions on the debate of preference versus diversity? Because in the household welfare, we can see that this debate happens in the couples, because in some of the resource settings, the couples might be interested in the preference. In some of the resource settings, they might be interested in the diversity. In that case, one assumption would be key is that the woman will be a part of the labor force, because that domain is most important. The second is I would be interested in the national welfare, because if you are a social scientist and if you are debating on the population dynamics, so you might be countered by the other social scientists from the anthropology or sociology, and they might question the fact that, okay, if you are working on the low income settings, so there might a debate comes of the global north versus the global south. Because some of the philosophers might tackle you with the counter argument that the global north might be interesting in the low population because of the fact that the agentic artificial intelligence and the innovation is on such a rise that they need less workforce to do the task, and they want to capture more of the resources.
Okay, I think we'll have to interrupt here. Sorry. We'll just take one or two others, maybe you can answer that. Teresa?
Thank you, Christine, for an interesting talk, and I hope that we all get to pick your brains also about our own research as the conference continues. I've done a little bit of work looking at how some biased fertility preferences impact outcomes like height for age in households. Some biased fertility is definitely a big issue in this region. I was wondering if you found or looked for any evidence of that in the context that you were studying, like in Nigeria.
Thanks, Teresa. Maybe one more we can take? Yes.
Presentation. Just explanatory kind of question might have already was answered, but we're short of time. Does these preferences subject to expectations of the spouses, they converge with the age post-match that they evaluate for many years, or if there is any kind of a trend in certain aspects where they converge and the others where they diverge? Because if you are going to target, for example, RCT specifically, then the age group would be also important.
Great. Thank you very much for the questions. Sorry, thank you very much for the questions. I want to change the difference, but hopefully it's working. So maybe I'll start with the last one, just because. So that's a very good point, and I think at some point I looked at that, and I honestly cannot remember, so I presume that it wasn't a massive convergence. But yeah, that's definitely something worth looking at. Whether repeated interactions, allow. But I think that so far, I think what's clear is that there isn't that much communication, or if there is communication, then there might not be so much convincing of each other. And then of course there's also the question of what are people talking about? I mean, even when if you think of disagreements with colleagues, for instance, often when you think about it, you're not questioning each other's assumptions. You're just like arguing, I've come to this outcome, you've come to that outcome, we disagree. But how many times do you actually go back and ask them, okay, so what do you believe will happen if we did X? And the same for you. And so I can imagine that even with communication and persuasion, you may not go down the ladder to like arguments so much. But yeah, that's a very good point. We should definitely double check. Great question about some biased preferences. So I haven't looked at it very much in the context.
Christine, it went off again. You just have to push it once.
Okay.
It's
Sorry.
It's on.
Oh, and then sorry. So embarrassing. So I haven't looked at it very much in the context of Mozambique or Nigeria, but so we're still working on this and we're trying to add heterogeneity across couples. And so one of the things that I've looked at is heterogeneity by whether or not the wife has a son already, because so there's increasing evidence that even though there is no evidence in sub-Saharan Africa in general or Nigeria in particular of missing women or anything like this, it's not to say that there isn't some preference, and it can express itself in various ways, and there's a couple of papers recently that show that it expresses itself in some ways, and for instance, women who have a son are less likely to divorce, etc. So that's what we've done so far in terms of animals, but yeah, we haven't collected data on height range or anything, or any other metrics, but yeah, that's very good. So about the first couple of questions, so you were interrupting with the second one, but I guess what you had in mind was a bit like, sort of neo-imperialism, and whether, like the global north has some kind of, hidden agenda and wants to limit population growth in low-income countries. So, I don't know, I think it's a valid hypothesis, and that's why I think I try to be, and I try today, and in general, I try to be as careful as possible, saying, I am not in the business of telling anybody that having 2 kids is better than having 4. In fact, myself, I think that if I hadn't done the job I did, I would have loved to have 4 children, or 5 even, it's just, so I'm really not here, I'm neither in the business of arguing in favor or understanding why people want to have, actually that's something that I find interesting that I haven't done so much work on, why you want to have 2 children instead of 5, 4, or vice versa. What I've really tried to focus on is this gap between what people actually want, so these given the preferences they have, right, and the decisions they're making every day in terms of, I don't want to say protection necessarily, but just like reducing the risk of pregnancy. And it's the gap between these two that I'm trying to understand and that I'm trying to find policy solutions for. So I hope this addresses, I hope this keeps me in the clear of, I don't have an agenda here, other than enabling people to have the fertility that they want to have. And just as a personal motivation, so yes, as an economist, I think that's fascinating. And I'm sure there's lots of other implications. I think you were alluding to what about labor force participation of women. I think that's what you meant by diversity. So of course there's lots of implications of fertility in terms of broader outcomes, but this is not something that I've really touched upon, certainly that's not something that I've talked about today. So I have 3 children, and I know how hard it is to have the children you want to have. So, anything that helps people not having the children they don't want to have, I'm all up for it.
Thank you very much, Christian. I think we could go on for a while longer. The conference organizers have said that maybe we can break for tea and everyone can bring some tea back. But I wanted to thank Christian. I think that was fascinating and it was very, very wonderful.